Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm sort of trawling through the socials and different sources to glean nuggets from here and there, basically so you don't have to, and hopefully I can aggregate, synthesize and inform you in a way that's useful for you. We'll go to Chris O'Wiki, another one of his threads. It's about former Wagner Group member fighters not being accepted back into Russian society as well as they might have hoped, given they were putting their bodies on the line for the Russian imperialistic intentions of Putin. Former Wagner Group fighters are finding to their dismay that few employers want to hire them. They can't even get jobs at Burger King. Quote, they are promised a life with a clean slate and the authorities fail to fulfill their promises, a relative complaint. The Russian independent news outlet We Can Explain reports that Wagner fighters sent on vacation after the Prigozhin mutiny in June are finding it difficult to get new jobs after the Wagner Group's expulsion from the war in Ukraine. An audio message sent to Wagner members in August urged them to find alternative work to support themselves. However, this is proving much more difficult than many had anticipated, with many having to take low-paid jobs instead. Wagner members and their relatives are complaining in online forums that they are being excluded from jobs at defense companies, factories, and the Russian National Guard. Instead, they are having to work as taxi drivers, construction workers, and doormen. MO interviewed some of the relatives. Svetlana, the mother of one Wagner fighter, says that her son, an ex-convict, planned to take a job at a new factory building kamikaze drones in Kamchatka. Even though he had an official pardon, the owners weren't interested. Quote, they said you'd better look for another place, Svetlana says. They didn't even take an application. The husband of Tatiana from Tyumen had a similar experience. Quote, he tried to get a job at a factory. Corporate security refused without explanation. Now he works in a taxi without being registered. MO contacted a recruitment agency working for the Chernyshev military engine plant. It was told that the company's corporate security department, quote, does not let in candidates with convictions for theft, drugs and murder, even those who have been pardoned. It appears that at least some of this may be due to pressure from Russian state security. MO was told by an agency handling recruitment at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport that, quote, the FSB constantly turns away such candidates. We really need people now, but we are forced to obey. This is the latest indignity to befall the former mercenaries. It was reported earlier that wounded Wagnerites had been evicted from hospitals with unhealed wounds, and I reported that to another Chris O'Wiki thread, and denied payments for ongoing medical care. Even Burger King, which still operates in Russia due to the local franchisee refusing to obey the US parent company's order to shut down, isn't taking Wagnerites. An agency recruiting, quote, assistant cooks refused to consider an application. Quote, the company's security service decides everything. We still have couriers. Maybe they'll hire a courier, a representative told MO. Not surprisingly, relatives are upset and have been filling chat rooms with complaints. Elena Masikova writes, my son works, but it's a shame that they were promised a life with a clean slate and the authorities failed to fulfill their promises. And there is no need to write again for the 100th time that it is not possible to remove a criminal record from the database and the guys did not understand correctly. They were promised and they believed, but in fact they were deceived. I mean, it doesn't surprise me particularly, just from a kind of human standpoint, if you have a choice of hiring, Joe Bloggs or Ivan, who's been convicted of a possibly terrible crime, gone to prison, been pardoned so he could go onto the front line and shoot people in the head, and then come back and look for a job, I'd be like, yeah, probably Joe Bloggs, to be honest. Yeah, he's got one fewer like GCSEs than you, or SATs or whatever, but he's not got a track record of killing other people. So, there is that. It doesn't surprise me. I don't think practically, again, it's empty promises from the Russian government. And I don't think it would ever have gone any other way. They are going to promise the world, the moon on a stick to these guys, and those promises were unrealistic, and they always were. and this is where you get to. And there are going to be an awful lot of people coming back from the front lines, not just actually Wagner, but regular conventional fighters who are going to be psychologically harmed by their experiences, that are going to struggle to get work. I mean, the PTSD, all sorts of issues are going to come to the fore, so that going forward, Russia's going to be having to deal with a huge, I guess, crisis, and especially with an underfunded medical and psychiatric system, given that most of their money is now being spent directly on the war. It's just the war is obviously the most stupid decision anyone could have ever made. But the ramifications for going to war in terms of, GDP, economics, different business sectors, hydrocarbons, exports, interest rates, unemployment, medical care, the whole lot, all of this, it's just a big hot mess. Right, I'm going to go to dip into the Ukraine, the latest from the Daily Telegraph. It's a great podcast. I listen to it ritually. Here they are releasing some kind of extra bits and pieces because they're in America doing a kind of bit of a tour at the moment. And there's a video that's well worth watching. It's not too long, hour and 20. Put that on double speed. You can chow through it. In this video, they talk to head of one of the head guy, woman from ISW, Kagan, a guy from CSIS, so Strategic Center, who is pretty prominent as well. Just a really interesting chat, and some of their own guys. I'm just going to dip into some of the claims from this discussion. First thing I'm going to do is just let David Knowles say some of his opening introductory remarks, because I think there was a pertinent moment here that I think is worth remembering for us all.
Now, and just to echo the remarks we heard just then, tonight, this podcast is not like other podcasts. We're talking about potentially one of the worst things, the most significant things the world has seen in the past 50 years. We need to temper our enthusiasm with sensitivity, our passion with kindness, and our interest in the events with solidarity. This is not a series on Netflix, it's not a video game, it's not even a good story for us journalists, it's people's lives every day, day in, day out, even today, right now. The stakes couldn't be higher for Ukraine, for democracy in the entire world. Thank you so much for listening. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we go to our first question, I would just ask our panel.
So I just thought that was a really good thing to say. It's pertinent, it's poignant, and it's worth remembering every day when we discuss this together. We're going to go to Dom Nichols next to see what his kind of synopsis of where we're at now. This is just on the back of him talking about how we've gone through two different phases or two separate wars, he says, in this war. We're now in the third war, this kind of counteroffensive phase. And that's where he goes from here.
And I think we're now transitioning to the third war, which is the who can stay there the longest war. So it's back into industry and society, and who can keep going, who can maintain that tempo of producing trained people and equipment, put them all together, you make a capability. And I think we're now seeing the longer term strategy. Putin still hasn't relinquished any of his maximalist aims. He wants to take over the whole country, and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think that is possible anymore. I think he's trying now to just last out Ukraine and the international community's support for Ukraine to see if he can stumble through to probably the US elections later next year, to then see if there's a crack in the international support and everyone loses interest and sort of sue for peace along the frozen, as he would wish it to be, the frozen lines as they are today. So I think we're now entering the proper industrial stage of this war, and the attritional grind of who can just stay there the longest. And I don't know which way that will go. We'll talk later about how solid or otherwise the external support for Ukraine is at the moment.
And actually, So the elections are a big thing. I mean, I know a lot of American viewers that I have here say, "Don't worry, there's bipartisan support. It shouldn't change too much." But this is at the top of people's concerns internationally. Like onlookers who look in at the U.S. elections do worry about what will happen, particularly if someone, I don't know, like Trump came into power. Now, there's an interesting interview in the Ukrainian Review with John Bolton, who's hawkish, was appointed by Trump, but has subsequently gone pretty much anti-Trump. I don't want to go down this whole rabbit hole of Trump and whatnot, but I will just point you towards this. I'll put this interview link in the description below. It talks about, because there's a really good answer to the common trope, the whole idea of many people say this, and Russian trolls do say this, that if Trump had been in charge, this war never would have happened, and he would have stopped Putin from invading Ukraine. And that's a really common claim, and he puts that one to bed. He talks about other things about what will happen if Trump is re-elected, so on and so forth. So that's worth watching. But anyway, not watching, worth reading. We'll go back to the Ukraine, the latest panel again. We're going to go to Kim Kagan now, who is from the ISW, wearing a nice, I think, Ukrainian-influenced or Ukrainian kind of jacket there. So she casts her opinion as to where we're at the moment.
Its territory. The war, as we see it right now, is slow-moving. That is a phase of this war. And it is likely to be temporary. We are observing not a stalemate, but positional war on the southern front. And the Ukrainians are trying very hard to advance through the thick lines of defenses that the Russians established in the winter and spring of this year, while the Ukrainians rebuilt their forces and combat power, and get themselves to within artillery range of the key line of supply that connects Russia to Crimea. And I think the Ukrainians will actually get close to that line this winter, and I think the Russians are going to have a problem. But there must be a successive operation, a follow-on counteroffensive that the Ukrainians can pursue in the spring.
We've talked a
And I'm now going to just pop in to see what Hamish de Breton Gordon says from Ukraine the Latest actual podcast yesterday about the counteroffensive that I thought was interesting and is exactly something that I think as well. And so it's good to see him put that into much better way than I could. So over to him now.
Thank you. Yes, just as I said, I've been at DSCI, the defence show in London this week, speaking to an awful lot of people, industry, current serving senior British and NATO commanders. I had one very interesting conversation with a very senior British commander who recently retired, who was very heavily involved in the Kosovo War. I was there as a very young captain, really cannot remember the great details of it. But he was explaining that in that war, when everything seemed to take an awful long time and progress not being made, but then suddenly, almost somebody taking the plug out of a dam, everything happened very quickly.
As a saying in war, where nothing happens all the time until everything happens at once, or whatever it is, and that's the sense I'm getting.
And we were successful. And he said he'd been discussing, obviously, with the counteroffensive, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. And he and others were very confident now that something similar is most likely to happen in Ukraine, that the dam of the sort of Russian defences is under severe strain. And at some point, that plug is going to come out. And
this is, talking about what I've been saying recently about how the screws, I think, are turning when you see the strikes in Crimea, when you see the hits on logistic. It's about, stretch, starve, strike. And you will see Ukraine striking when the moment is right, when that dam starts to break. And the question is, I'll be seeing that now. Have they got to that point yet, or is that still weeks off? Is it months off? Will this be something that actually happens, going into winter, and it's just not the right point yet? I don't know. I can't answer those questions, but I do get this sense. Now, is that me being hopeful? Is that me being pro-Ukrainian and thinking that? I don't know. Possibly there will be an element of that, I'm sure, in there. But there was another point in one of the podcasts, I think it was maybe the next Ukraine the latest, with Dom Nichols saying that he was speaking to someone in the US, an analyst in the US, I think, or someone in the know, who basically said, when you look at the Ukrainian general staff figures, just take 20% off that, and that's broadly where they're at. In other words, so where I've been saying, God, even if you took 50% off those figures, there'd still be 20% off the Ukrainian figures to give you an accurate sense of what's going on. They are losing an absolute ton of stuff, the Russians, on a daily basis. So that was interesting, and you just get this sense that the dam is teetering, surely.
And the expectation is that the counteroffensive will gain momentum and be successful. So it was interesting. I add that he is not serving at the moment, but somebody who really knows a lot about these things. It's all the discussions we're having about it, all the activity that's going on. I'm still absolutely 100% behind and supporting, and expect the Ukrainian counteroffensive to be successful, hopefully sooner rather than later.
I thought that's a pretty good summation there. We'll go back to the panel discussion. I think there was a little nugget about Zelensky here that I thought was interesting, so I'm going to share that with you.
Elliot, can you talk a little bit about how Ukraine might define victory? And you mentioned you met Zelensky. We've talked a lot about Putin. What was your experience meeting Vladimir Zelensky?
So that was on my first visit to Ukraine about a year ago, and I can't say there was anything surprising in that. The way he presents in a small meeting is quite similar to how he presents publicly. I mean, I suppose the things that struck me most about him is first, he looked like he was in good shape, which is critical. There can be nothing more taxing, both physically and psychologically and spiritually, than leading a country in a desperate war. And he looked like a guy who was getting enough sleep, who was working out, and was fully in command. And I think that's a great advantage to them. Very good sense of humor, and unusually for any politician, he devoted as much time to listening as to talking.
Wow, I thought that was interesting.
And so I came away, I expected to be impressed, and I was. I came away even more impressed.
So let's go on to another moment. So still with Elliot Cohen.
On balance, the most likely thing is that Putin or a successor will probably try again in some way. And so the question is, what are the guarantees of Ukrainian security? Well, one is it's already the largest, most experienced army in Europe. But I think the other really has to be its integration into NATO. And I believe that the other possibilities that people have put out there of security guarantees, or things of that nature, don't work. And that what we need to be thinking now is about how do you get Ukraine into NATO? Because that's the only security guarantee in Europe that has ever worked is NATO membership. The Russians have not dared to throw a punch at least using overt means, at places like Rzeszów, which is where the Poles transship a lot of most of the military hardware that goes into Ukraine. And that's a difficult task. Last thing I'll just say on that one, there is a major summit coming up in Washington. This is, of course, a major anniversary of the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. And that would be the moment to really lay out a very, very clear roadmap, not with broad statements like when they meet the criteria without defining the criteria, which is what diplomats sometimes do, with all due respect. But to actually, I was one for a couple of years, so I plead guilty too. But really a very clear roadmap, making clear that Ukraine, yes, not only that as a general statement of intent, but here is a timeline which will bring Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
And I think that's really interesting. We'll, I guess, see if that materializes. We're going to go to Francis Durnley from The Telegraph now.
If you do certain things. And I think there is a fundamental belief in Europe that when push comes to shove, there are certain things that are beyond the pale. So in that sense, I wasn't surprised, but I'll tell you what has surprised me, which is that we have learnt, you have learnt by listening to us, how bad things really are in Ukraine. The war crimes are far worse than I thought I would ever see in my lifetime on European soil, particularly the kidnapping of children, but also the kind of crimes we've seen at Bucha and Irpin. And what has shocked me is that the more we have learned, it seems that the more people have almost become numb to it and have sought to switch off from it. And I speak about that with people I know in political circles and even in journalism. And I think in part it's because, you know, it's been going on a long time and to a degree that the agenda moves on. But I also think there's something deeper psychologically in play, which is the truth is so terrible and so morally stark that it becomes easier to ignore it than to confront it. And I think that is a shameful thing to admit is happening on quite a universal scale. And yet I think it is happening. And I think it is something that needs to be addressed. And I think it should be the responsibilities of politicians around Europe to be talking much more eloquently and with much more visual evidence of what has been occurring in Ukraine. Because, and just if I may say one more thing, David, I'll never forget the early shift I came in on the day after the invasion began and in the subsequent days. We get rushes coming in of photography taken around the world. And a lot of them are not publishable. But we as editors, we look at them, we see them, and we're making decisions about what will go in the paper. I don't, but I'm in the meetings where people are deciding those things. And if you could see some of the photographs that I've seen of people dressed in the clothes we're wearing here today, being bundled in pits, children, men, women in their 20s, I don't think we would get this hand-wringing that we see. And yet, unfortunately, it's not out there in the public consciousness. And until it is, I am worried.
I think that's a super important point, and we must remember the degree of absolute disgusting war criminality that is clearly evidenced. I mean, there is so much evidence to support this, but we just don't see a lot of it because it's unpublishable. Goodness me, I get demonetized by YouTube this morning for showing some explosion in the distance, and yet, and that kind of keeps us at arm's distance from maybe some of the truly horrific things that have happened. And that's good. We don't want to see horrific things. We want to maintain a healthy psyche. But actually, if we are going to treat Russia appropriately, politically, diplomatically, popularly, you know, in our social consciences, and then we need to properly understand what Russia have done systematically in Ukraine. And there is plentiful evidence of genocide and deplorable war criminal activity that he so eloquently communicates is not able to influence enough those politicians in Europe and in the world who are making decisions about what's going on. So when you see people push back, maybe in the US with kind of fringe politicians, say, who are being pro-Russian, like, I wonder if you sat them down and showed them a slideshow of what's actually taken place, educate them to what has really been going on, whether they would still be able to maintain those opinions. So I think that was a really eloquently stated point by Francis Durnley there. It really was. Kim Kagan adds really eloquently to this.
Thank you so much, Elliot, and thanks, Francis, also for raising the issue of the atrocities and war crimes that the Russians are perpetrating. I think that it is important to see in them, of course, the human depravity, but it is also important to see in them the organized and purposeful use of violence against women, against children, the extermination of civilians that is actually executed consistently in different parts of Russian-occupied Ukraine, and recognize that that is a systematic, organized, and militarized use of violence against civilians, rather than the depravity, simply, of soldiers gone astray.
That's a really key point, because it's not just as you might come across the odd war crime that the Ukrainians have committed, right? And that will be the latter case, which is like, these are humans at war. They ended up just going a bit nuts in this environment and doing something bad. But it's when it's systematized, when it's almost, well, it's not almost, when it's like an institutionally organized approach to doing warfare, then we have, really large-scale war crimes that will go all the way up the hierarchical chain, and hopefully you'll end up with people in court in The Hague.
That is important for us to recognize, because every day behind the lines that the Russians occupy, there are people who are experiencing what was experienced in Bucha, or what is, or had been experienced in parts of Mariupol. And so when we think about what lies ahead and the hard fight that lies ahead for Ukraine, I think it's important that we think about, of course, some of the geopolitical issues, but we're not talking about Ukraine liberating its territory. It's about liberating people.
That is a hugely significant point that's easily overlooked. When you guys and I, when we sit and look at a map and say, oh, they're struggling to get past, I don't know, Slovitny Byzania, just south of Orozhany, and they need to liberate this area in order to move on to liberate Tokmak, and they need to get to Tokmak in order to get fire control over Berdyansk and the M14 highway, and he's thinking all these terms, which is absolutely correct, like from a military standpoint. But what sometimes we forget is that this isn't about liberating territory. What is territory? It is land for people to live in, and is land to sustain the life of people. So it's about those people. Very often, yeah, we can talk about Crimea as being a place for Putin that has a deep sea port. So it's not about, for Putin, it's not about the people. For Zelensky, it is about the people. And for as long as these Ukrainians are living in occupied territories controlled by the Russians, they will be experiencing things like Bucha on a daily basis.
Free people who are actually being abused and oppressed. It's about bringing home Ukrainian children who have been deliberately abducted, at least apparently deliberately abducted, by Russian authorities for the purpose of their re-education and reacculturation into a Russian language and society and culture. Those are acts that within the genocide conventions constitute genocide. And I think it's very important actually to state that because we as moral human beings who have an experience of freedom and independence owe it to those who do not. To recognize what we have and what they are deprived of and what others are fighting to give them. But I think it's also important, if I may, to say that One of the things that strikes me about this war is the extraordinary clarity that it has brought to many about the international situation, the world that we're in. If, in fact, an aggressive bully can simply invade a neighboring sovereign state for the purpose of destroying that state and removing it from the map and the state system, if that happens in one state and the United States or Europe or the United Kingdom actually stand by and watch, it can actually happen anywhere. And I think one of the reasons why we have seen such clarity of purpose in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in NATO, and with our allies afar, such as the Japanese, is that, in fact, what is at stake here in Ukraine is not simply about Ukraine. It's about the geopolitical order in which we live, and whether any aggressor can overturn that order by force.
I thought that's brilliant. And I know quite often you get Russian trolls come on threads, and whenever I use ISW as a source to, which I think is an excellent source for aggregating the Russian voices and the Ukrainian voices, and without, in the parts I use them, without too much analysis, it's just like, this is what the Russians are claiming about Bakhmut, and this is what Ukrainians are claiming about Bakhmut. We haven't seen evidence of either of these, or some of these, or whatever, but it's just like, you can't attack them for being X or Y when all they're doing is just reporting what is being claimed, right? But you always know a pro-Russian because they come and say, I can't believe you're using ISW, they're just Kagan is a neocon. Well, I don't like neocons, politically speaking, but if she is I mean, I know very little about this woman, but if when I see her sit there and say that with such moral clarity, then like I couldn't give a toss what you think she is. Here, she's expressing the true moral value of supporting Ukraine as staunchly as hopefully many in the world are. I just think there's a really good collection of opinions going on in this panel. I'm going to leave it there for now. There's much more to look at in there. I'm actually going to flip to this is a really good haul for the Ukrainian latest. They got an interview with Mitt Romney, who, presidential candidate in times past, just as he had announced that he was going to retire. So they managed to get this interview, and it was really interesting. I just want to play you this excerpt. I mean, there's some fascinating stuff. He talks about republicanism, the Republican Party, and how there are two kind of elements to that. He's like the old wise Republican, and you get this new kind of brash MAGA Republicanism, and he's says some really on point things about that, in my opinion. I'm not going to play that. I don't want to start that argument here. I'm just going to take it from here.
In your view, did the West go far enough to isolate Russia?
No, I don't think so. I do acknowledge that we made extraordinary strides to come together, provide the weaponry that Ukraine needed. We have a lot more to do with regards to China. On the Russia front, I think we've collaborated very effectively. I'm concerned that in my country, you're seeing some people say, okay, we've done enough, let's move on. In my opinion, that's very foolish, very short-sighted, because if Russia thinks they can get away with what they did in Ukraine, China's going to feel the same way about Taiwan. Other authoritarians are going to say, why don't we take the population and resources of our neighbor? That's just not something that I think that the liberal democracies of the world can countenance.
What do you say to those figures then in your own party who say it's too expensive for America to keep supporting Ukraine?
There are a lot of excuses that populists have to do what they want to do, but the idea that it's too expensive is a little funny. We spend about $850 billion a year on defense. We're using about 5% of that to help Ukraine. My goodness, to defend freedom and to decimate the Russian military, a country with 1,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us, to be able to do that with 5% of your military budget strikes me as an extraordinarily wise investment, and not by any means something we can't afford.
How would...
I mean, something I've said many times is the return on investment is insanely good. I mean, goodness, and I said this the other day, if you were to go back 40 years and speak to anyone in US politics and say, right, in the height of the Cold War, right, if we spend less than 5% of our defense budget on completely screwing over Russia so that they're out of the race. Should we do that? I mean, that's basically what the entirety of the US defense budget used to be spent on, like broadly speaking. Okay, a lot of, but even all the other things around the world were in the framework of the hegemony, of the US versus USSR. So, it is just an extraordinarily well spent, assistance, I think. Right, there's so much more to say even from that interview. I mean, goodness, there's so much good content out there. I've probably spoken for a bit long. Or not me, the sources I'm referring to. I just want to dip into Slovakia now, very quickly. This is a great BBC radio documentary called Slovakia Divided. Just to give you a sense of what's going on there, where Slovakia, for those who don't know, it borders Ukraine beneath Poland. It is, it used to be obviously part of Czechoslovakia, and now, it's Slovakia. My mate has a backpackers in the Tatras Mountains in Slovakia, in a place. Oh, I've been to Poprad. I've been to a lovely little water park there. Nice. Anyway, a place called Ždiar. I wonder where that is. It's around there somewhere. Transka. Yeah. Anyway, that's irrelevant. But if you ever go to the Ginger Monkey, that's my mate's place. Anyway, Slovakia is a place that is politically pretty interesting at the moment. Let's see what the podcast has to say.
What's remarkable about Slovakia is that per capita, it's been one of Ukraine's staunchest backers. That, she says, looks set to change.
Currently, there are parties which very openly express their reluctance to support Ukraine, especially when it comes to armed supplies and military support. And if these parties win or form the coalition government, there is really a chance that the EU unity or the NATO unity in terms of the support for Ukraine could crumble further.
Since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Slovakia has gone all in, even providing MiG-29 jets to Ukraine. All the while, opinion polls have pointed in the opposite direction. Dominika Hajdu gives me the rundown.
When it comes to the war itself, the majority of the population says that it's either the West or Ukrainians themselves who are primarily responsible for the war. Only 40% of Slovaks actually believe that it's Russia who is primarily responsible for the war, which is the lowest percentage in the entire Central and Eastern European region.
Globsek's latest annual survey makes for salutary reading, with Slovakia often out of step with its neighbours. Now 50% of Slovaks believe the United States to be a security risk, a figure sharply up on just a few years ago.
That's a
if
real
the elections
worry.
follow predictions, and there's still a lot to play for, this country could be about to do a 180-degree turn and go full pelt for Putin.
My name is Luboš Blaha. I'm the member of parliament and the vice chair of Slovak Social Democratic Party, Smer Social Democracy.
Smer is comfortably ahead of all the other parties in the polls, and Luboš Blaha, an unabashed scourge of the liberal West, could become a prominent member of the government.
We need to stop sending the weapons and the military equipment to Ukraine, and we need to stop this war, whatever price. I can understand that Ukrainians wouldn't be happy that they will lose, for example, Donbass or Crimea. But still, I think now in this situation, we need to be realistic, we need to be in the table, and we need to speak Russians, Americans, Ukrainians.
We need to be realistic. So, yeah, they've lost Crimea, and it's like burglars have come around your house and they've helped themselves to your all the stuff in your lounge. You need to be realistic. I'd let them have that. Just be realistic about it. Oh, what? So I can't fight for myself? No. They might beat you. It's just like, no. How about standing up for what's right rather than what you think is realistic? Which also appears to align with Russian success.
Everybody who is involved in this war, and we see that this war is not only the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We see it as a proxy war of the United States against Russia in Ukrainian land.
And my prediction is always, and you'll see this comes true here, is that we'll see this isn't going to be a war about sovereign integrity. This is going to be a culture war, which is what people on the far right always defer to. It's just one of those things.
This is something very different.
I spend an hour with Luboš Blaha sitting on a terrace outside Slovakia's parliament. He's a consummate polemicist, as many populists are. But the longer he talks, the more extreme his language becomes. He frames Russia's conflict with the West less in military terms, more as a culture war.
People in Slovakia are very mistrusted to the Western individualistic culture, especially in these cultural issues like these LGBT, like these family issues. And when we see that there are politicians who are more maybe conservative or who are maybe more traditional, there is a little sympathy for them, and it's not because they are making the war, it is not because they are making some undemocratic measures, but because they are protecting their national culture, national identity against this liberal mania in the West.
What is the
So, in other words, Ukraine represent liberal mania. It's all about Ukrainians supporting gays. So therefore, hey, if Russia are more about traditional family values, then I'm going to support them, even if it means like that they're doing war crimes against Ukrainians, because that's more important than, I don't know, sexual human rights or whatever.
Liberal mania.
In cultural issues, it's this progressivism. It's progressivism that you can have so much sexes or genders as you can, and this is something which is not very popular in Slovakia. We have just families with mothers, fathers, and children. We don't need to have families.
What you find, don't want to sidetrack this, but I think I wrote an article on this recently on kind of wokeism, and it's my trigger word. But you'll find that it gets shouted about so much, like gender issues and you know, someone going into a bathroom and X, Y, and Z. It's like, right, when women go to the toilet, they have little cubicles, so it's not a urinal. You don't go and see other people's bits and pieces, and etc. And you're like, but then you think, look, how often is something like this going to be an issue? How big an issue is it in your life? Like, there's someone like this who's saying it's all these cultural issues. Okay. In your life right now, how has that affected you on a daily basis? Because things that affect me are stuff like interest rates, employment, aspiration, and it's all these kind of, all this kind of stuff that has, government policies that have tangible effect on my day-to-day living. All this kind of culture wars fluff, you'll find, is actually fairly vacuous, because they like to shout about it, but it kind of excuses the fact they don't have much policy elsewhere, or they realize that this drives people intuitively, but it's completely skews the actual significance of these issues in society. It's just not kind of representative of the issues people have on a daily basis, but they feel like they do, and they talk about it more and they shout about it lots because they're being fueled by this kind of narrative.
With the fathers and so on.
What I find so extraordinary is here we are, we're sitting in the parliamentary cafe right next to Parliament, over the Danube. As we're looking straight ahead, beyond the forests is Austria. I was in this spot in the 80s when this was the Iron Curtain. It was impossible for you, your family, or anybody you know to cross that highly fortified border. And now you're talking about liberal American fantasies and liberal fascism. What on earth happened to any idea of liberal democracy?
Well, first of all, people found what is capitalism like. This is the first question. The imagination was before the revolution, or how to say it, Velvet Revolution, was that everything will be good, that the wages will be good, that living standards will be like in Sweden or like in Austria. But then the reality came, and people are poor. People in Slovakia are still poor. So they are asking, okay, now I am free to be a capitalist, but I have no money, so it's not something option for me.
Interesting. Let's have a look at that. And this is like populism, just like driving up popular discontent or anger about things that are essentially lies. I mean, Slovaks live better now than before 1989. Statistics show, let's look at the actual stats, but many people still yield to myths about the communist regime and nostalgia. I mean, you look at Slovak Republic statistics for, working, for life expectancy, for access to healthcare, all this kind of stuff. It's just nonsense. Anyway, I'm liable to just go off on one now, but just be warned that you can get sucked into these kind of populist worldviews or populist narratives if you jump on it with, I'm really angry about transgender issues, so I'm going to jump on this wagon, and then you just get fed all this other nonsense, and before you know it, you are like anti-US, anti-NATO, pro-Russia, and spouting all this nonsense and then voting for extreme governments. If that happens in Slovakia, the polls appear to be accurate, then you end up having a country that is more under the sphere of influence of Russia than it is of the West, and that's obviously not going to bode well for Ukraine, but doesn't bode well for the future of democracy in Europe. So just be warned. Anyway, that's my tuppence worth there. I've got lots more to say. I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully that was of use. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much for all of your support. Your kindness is really incredible. Take care, and I will speak to you soon.